corporate brand. The corporate brand had relevance to their investors. The corporate brand had relevance to their employees, but it didn't have any relevance to the customers at all. And they felt that actually, for the first time, they would change that. And they worked very hard because they realised that actually what they wanted to do was focus very much on their reputation. They realised that the corporate brand actually was the gatekeeper really to their reputation. It wasn't just their products. Their products were great. People love Marmite, Dove soap and so on. But actually they realised how much importance there was in their corporate brand and in their reputation. So that's why you now see the Unilever logo on ski, on Dove, on Marmite and so on. But that's not just about putting a logo on a piece of packaging. Actually, it's really very much where they are taking their business. They've totally changed the way that they've structured their communications, so that actually Unilever's corporate brand now has a relevance to that consumer audience in a way that it never had before. And that brings us probably to the kind of real final area of convergence, which is this fundamental shift of power away from shareholders to stakeholders. In the 1970s, the average hold time from an investor was 7 years. Investors would hold stock from a company for 7 years. The average time now is 7 months. That's a tremendous change in a relatively short space of time. And that short-termism is quite worrying, really. Where does the reputation of the corporate brand lie? Companies are beginning to have to re-evaluate what their business is for. And companies are beginning to look to see other models. Because we have this very short-term perspective in the UK, companies are starting to look elsewhere in the world. And McKinsey's Global Managing Director, Dominic Barton, has done a lot in this area. He's written, he wrote something in Harvard Business Review earlier this year on what he terms long-term capitalism, having looked at the Western models and compared that to some of the models in Asia and China. And he started thinking about this when he had a meeting with the president of Korea, whose name I can't remember, which is lucky because I probably couldn't pronounce it. And he started talking about a 60-year plan for positioning Korea and positioning its reputation. 60 years. In the end, I think they settled on a strategy that was called Korea 2020, so I presume that they whittled that down a little bit shorter. But that was phenomenal, and that made Dominic Barton start looking at that approach that Asian companies have, which is a much more long-term approach, and really focusing very, very heavily on building reputation and corporate brand over a period of time. We saw Samsung start this process about 5 years prior to sponsoring the Olympics back in whenever it was in the 80s, as a way of developing and building, not just selling more products, but building that reputation. And I think that there are Western companies that do that as well. I think Apple have a very long-term view as well. We've seen that with the iPod, for instance, which we forget now that actually the iPod didn't really sell very well at the beginning. I think in its first year it sold fewer than 500,000 copies units. But their approach was very much a long-term strategy with the iPod. Now Barton cites 3 things that organisations have got to do. Firstly, abandon that short-termism. But secondly, and I think more relevant to this audience, and I'm going to quote him here actually, he says, executives must infuse their organisations with the perspective that serving the interests of all major stakeholders, employees, suppliers, customers, creditors, communities, the environment, is not at odds with the goal of maximising corporate value. On the contrary, it's essential to achieving that goal. And he sees very much the idea that moving away from focusing on shareholders is really important, and actually to start focusing on wider stakeholders, on that converging of audiences, talking to them by converging content, talking to them from a single voice, really, within the organisation, which is one of the reasons why I think corporate communications has never been a more exciting time to work. It's never been a more exciting time to work in the corporate communications team. And I think when you start seeing things from that multi-stakeholder perspective, you've got to start asking, what are companies for? And it brings up other questions, such as who holds your reputation? Who is the judge of an organisation? Going back to Unilever, you know, they feel that that reputation is something that is held by all stakeholders, and they've moved together customers, the investors, the employees, and so on. And it's a company that really has mapped out a very long-term brand strategy with its long-term needs. They've listened to all of their various audiences, and that's how they've positioned themselves. And I think that's the kind of exciting thing. We're now an opportunity, really, to hold, to manage, to control your corporate reputation with all of the various tools that are out there. So those are the things really that we've been noticing about. They're the things that we've been writing about in the magazine. They're the things that we regularly cover in our conferences. And they're the things that, by and large, tend to win the awards at our various awards events. Thanks very much.